Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku lost control of One for All. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in the unforeseen simulation joint's downpour zone was thick with the manufactured scent of rain and damp earth, but Izuku Midoriya was a sunbeam of focused energy cutting through the gloom. A year ago, this level of chaos would have sent him into a tailspin of frantic muttering and shattered bones. Now, it was a symphony he was learning to conduct. 2 more confirmed, West Quadrant, 3rd floor of the collapsed office building. Ida's voice, crisp and authoritative, crackled through his earpiece. Uraraka-san is on site, but the structure is unstable. Midoriya, requesting mobility support. On my way! Deku responded, his voice steady. Below him, a simulated flash flood surged through the streets of the Mach City block. Todoroki had already erected a series of glittering ice ramps, channeling the water away from a designated safe zone where Yaoyorozu was busy creating emergency blankets and first aid kits. It was a well-oiled machine, this class of heroes in training. They had faced real death and come out the other side harder, smarter, and more unified. Deku soared. Float, once a dizzying, uncontrollable lurch, was now a second-nature extension of his will. He adjusted his trajectory with a minute flex of his core, the green lightning of One for All a gentle, humming nimbus around him rather than a raging storm. He landed as softly as a cat on the edge of a cratered rooftop, his eyes already scanning the target building. The structure was a mangled skeleton of steel and concrete, groaning under its own weight. Through a shattered window, he could see the faint pink glow of Uraraka's quirk. She was levitating chunks of debris, clearing a path for a pair of rescue dummies trapped beneath a fallen support beam. Uraraka-san, status? He called, his voice amplified just enough by his calm. Almost there, Deku-kun! She grunted, the strain evident in her tone. This main beam is the problem. It's too heavy for me to lift completely, and if I make it weightless, the whole ceiling could go. Classic rescue dilemma? A problem that required not just power, but precision. Deku took a deep breath, sinking into the calm, analytical space All Might had been teaching him to find. Think. Don't just smash. Fine black tendrils, no thicker than wire, unspooled from his fingertips. This was not the chaotic, emotional explosion Black Whip had once been. This was controlled, deliberate. The tendrils snaked through the air, weaving through holes in the building's facade like a dozen sentient needles. They found purchase, wrapping around the massive concrete beam not with crushing force, but with a secure, distributed grip. Uraraka tapped the floating rubble, which clattered harmlessly to the side. Deku gritted his teeth, One for All surging not into his limbs, but directly into the Black Whip tendrils. With a controlled, monumental effort, he lifted the multi-ton beam a clean 5 feet into the air, holding it steady. The muscles in his back and arms screamed, but his bones held. His suit's internal bracers whirred, offering support. Uraraka zipped in, tapped the 2 dummies, and floated them out with practiced ease. Clear! Deku gently lowered the beam, the Black Whip tendrils retracting back into his skin as if they'd never been there. He felt a swell of quiet pride. This was it. This was being a hero. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about this, the precise application of overwhelming power to save, to protect. Excellent work, both of you. Came Aizawa's tired drawl over the comms, a rare and therefore potent compliment. Midoriya, your control of Black Whip has improved tenfold. Keep this up. The exercise concludes in 20 minutes. Sweep your sectors one last time. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the class. Deku grinned, wiping a smear of grime from his cheek. He could feel the familiar, comforting presence of the vestiges in the back of his mind. A silent, supportive audience. Nana Shimura's warmth, Yoichi's quiet encouragement. They were proud of him, too. He was about to use float to move to the next sector when a sharp, piercing static ripped through his earpiece, making him flinch. Scree, click, silence. Hello? Aizawa-sensei? Deku asked, tapping his calm nothing. Todoroki-kun? Ida-kun? Can anyone hear me? Only the hiss of dead air answered. A cold knot of dread, an old and unwelcome acquaintance, began to form in his stomach. Training accidents happened, but a total communications blackout? Across the entire facility? That's when the ground shook. It wasn't the simulated tremor from the exercise. This was a violent, percussive boom that originated from the entrance of the USJ. Deku spun around, his eyes widening. A plume of black smoke was rising from where the main gates, and their supervising teachers, Aizawa and Cementas, were located. Another boom, this one closer. The base of the office building he stood on shuddered violently. It wasn't crumbling from instability. It felt like it had been struck by a colossal hammer. What was that? Uraraka cried, stumbling as she landed near him. It's not the simulation, Deku said, his voice dropping into the low, serious tone his friends had come to associate with real danger. It's a real attack. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. Deku's mind raced, processing variables. Pro-heroes neutralized first. Communications jammed. A targeted tactical strike? This isn't the League of Villains. This is different. More professional. Before he could formulate a plan, the attack escalated. From the periphery of the training zone, cloaked figures emerged. One slammed his hands on the ground, and thick, obsidian-like walls erupted, boxing in the central plaza and separating Todoroki and Yayorozu from the rest of the zone. Another pointed a device towards the sky, and a shimmering dome of energy flickered into existence over the USJ, cutting off the outside world. They were being dismantled. Isolated. We have to get back to the entrance. We have to help Aizawa-sensei, Uraraka said, her face pale but determined. Right. Deku agreed, his body thrumming with nervous energy. We stick together. A third boom, deafeningly close, blew the top 2 floors of their building to smithereens. The shockwave sent them skidding across the rooftop. Deku instinctively grabbed Uraraka, pulling her behind him as a shower of concrete and glass rained down. He activated One for All at 5%, the power of familiar armor against the debris. When the dust settled, a figure stood on the opposite end of the roof. He was tall and lean, dressed in a simple but elegant gray suit that seemed bizarrely out of place amidst the chaos. He wore no mask, his face calm and intelligent, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through Deku. He held a conductor's baton in one hand, tapping it idly against his palm. Izuku Midoriya, the man said, his voice resonating with an unnatural clarity, bypassing the dead calms as if he were speaking directly inside their heads. The 9th vessel, a legacy of reckless power, currently throttled by a child's morality. A fascinating disappointment. Deku's blood ran cold. He knows about One for All. Who are you? Deku demanded, shifting into a low fighting stance. Uraraka was right behind him, her hands held ready, but she was trembling. The man smiled, a thin, condescending curve of his lips. I am Conductor. And we are the Correction. We believe the hero system is flawed. It's a revolving door, you see. You capture a villain, they escape. You defeat them, they return stronger. You show them mercy, and they repay your sentimentality with more death, more destruction. It's an inefficient, emotional, and ultimately self-defeating cycle. He raised his baton and pointed it at a twisted steel girder dangling precariously from the ruined floor above. He tapped the air. The girder, 50 feet away, suddenly convulsed as if struck and shot downwards like a spear, aimed directly at them. Deku reacted without thinking, shoving Uraraka aside and launching a 15% Delaware smash. The compressed air bullet met the girder mid-flight, shattering it into 1,000 pieces of shrapnel. Impressive reaction time, Conductor noted, his expression unchanged. But you see, that's my point. Your first instinct is to destroy the threat to yourself. A valid survival instinct, yet when faced with the source of the threat, a person, you hesitate. You hold back. You aim to capture, to subdue. You refuse to remove the piece from the board permanently. Black Whip lashed out from Deku's arm, a dark spear aimed for the man's chest. Conductor simply sidestepped, the tendril hissing past him. He tapped his baton on the rooftop where Deku stood. The concrete beneath Deku's feet exploded upwards. Deku yelped, using float to launch himself into the air. This villain's quirk, it seemed to be a form of telekinesis, but more precise. He was transferring kinetic energy, A tap of his baton was like an invisible punch. Your friends are all busy. Conductor continued, his voice a calm lecture amidst the battle. The explosive one is being occupied by my subharmonic. The elemental one is trapped. Your teachers are indisposed. It's just you, me, and the girl. He glanced at Uraraka, and his smile widened. Deku's stomach plummeted. He's a psychological fighter. He's isolating me. He's targeting her. Let's conduct a little experiment, shall we? Conductor said. He flicked his baton towards Uraraka. It wasn't an attack, just a gesture, but behind her, a huge chunk of the retaining wall cracked and began to tilt. Uraraka, seeing the danger, spun around and placed her hands on it, activating her quirk. I've got it! She yelled, her fingertips glowing pink as she fought to make the massive slab weightless. But she was already tired from the rescue exercise. The strain was visible on her face. Ah, yes! Uravity. A useful quirk for nullifying an object's mass, Conductor mused. But kinetic energy and mass are not the same thing. An object with zero mass can still carry momentum. He tapped the air again. The floating slab, held in place by Uraraka's power, was suddenly slammed by an invisible force. It flew backwards, carrying her with it. She cried out as her back slammed into a remaining piece of the building's antenna array. Her concentration broke. The slab regained its weight and crashed down near her, one edge pinning her leg with a sickening crunch. Uraraka-san! Deku screamed. Her cry of pain was sharp and ragged. She tried to push the slab, but her leg was trapped, an unnatural angle visible even from a distance. She was vulnerable. Helpless. Deku's vision tunneled. Everything else faded away, the smoke, the distant sounds of fighting, the USJ itself. There was only the villain, the smug, analytical look on his face, and Ochako, injured and in his line of fire. Don't you see Izuku Midoriya? Conductor's voice was a silky poison in his mind. Your entire philosophy is a liability. A bug in the system. You believe in second chances. You believe in salvation, but the world is not a hopeful story. It's a brutal equation of cause and effect. And the cause of her pain, right now, is your hesitation. He began walking slowly towards Uraraka, who was desperately trying to scrabble away, her face a mask of pain and fear. I'm going to prove it to you, Conductor said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet still ringing perfectly in Deku's ears. I am going to kill her. And it will be your fault. The entire world will know that the inheritor of One for All stood by while his friend was murdered, all because he was too weak, too sentimental, to do what was necessary. Deku's breath hitched. A roaring began in his ears. The quiet, supportive whispers of the vestiges were gone, replaced by a furious, discordant shriek. It was the sound of 8 lifetimes of rage, frustration, and battle, all screaming at once. No! Conductor raised his baton, pointing its tip at Uraraka's head. She will be the cost of your heroism. A lesson written in blood. Ochako looked at Deku. Her eyes were wide with terror, but also with a defiant trust. She believed he would save her. That belief was a hotter brand on his soul than any physical injury. He could feel it then. A deep, primal fissure cracking open at the very core of his being. The carefully constructed dams of control he had spent months building, the meditation with all might, the brutal training with Bakugo, the quiet moments of focus, were being washed away by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated fury. It wasn't the righteous anger of a hero. It was the possessive, feral rage of something seeing what it valued about to be destroyed. Save her. Save her. Save her. No matter the cost. The thought wasn't entirely his own. It was colder. Sharper. More absolute. Stop! Deku whispered, clutching his head. Green lightning began to arc wildly from his body, charring the concrete around his feet. Conductor merely smiled. Too late, he flicked his wrist. In that infinitesimal moment, as the kinetic command was sent, as Uraraka flinched, as the world held its breath, something inside Izuku Midoriya broke. He didn't just scream. The sound that ripped from his throat was inhuman, a tearing of reality itself. It was the shriek of a dying star and a crumbling mountain. The gentle green nimbus of One for All detonated. It was not a smash. It was an eruption. A chaotic, untamed apocalypse of power burst forth, a hurricane of iridian lightning and writhing black tendrils of pure energy. The rooftop beneath him disintegrated. The air itself seemed to scream, smelling of ozone and scorched iron. The very light bent around his form, as if space and time were recoiling from the sheer density of the power he was exuding. Conductor's attack, the invisible kinetic bullet aimed at Uraraka's skull, fizzled out a foot from its target, neutralized by the sheer atmospheric pressure of Deku's release. The villain's smug expression finally vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, and then fear. The energy he was sensing was ancient, vicious. Through the maelstrom, Deku looked up. His eyes were no longer the warm, emotional emerald green of a boy who cried when he was happy and bled when he was brave. They were a piercing, glacial cyan. Cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of emotion. They were the eyes of a predator that had just spotted its prey. The eyes of a soldier from a forgotten, brutal war. His posture changed. The slight, eager hunch was gone. He stood unnaturally still, perfectly balanced, his head tilted in a gesture of cold assessment. The roaring storm of power began to coalesce, the wild lightning shrinking back to cling to his skin like a second, lethal epidermis, the black whip tendrils retracting slightly, poised and waiting. The raw chaos was being instantly, terrifyingly, honed. Conductor, for the first time, took a step back. He tapped his baton at a large satellite dish on a nearby roof, attempting to send it hurtling at this new threat. The thing wearing Deku's face didn't even look at it. It moved. It didn't jump or run. It simply disappeared. Using a microscopic burst of float for lift and a 100% kinetic charge from FA gene released through a single toe, it crossed the 50-foot distance in less time than it took to blink. It wasn't the movement of a hero. It was the movement of an apex predator closing for the kill. Conductor's eyes widened as Deku reappeared directly in front of him, the air cracking with his arrival. He swung his baton desperately. The arm that caught his wrist was not the arm of a 15-year-old boy. It was a vice. The grip was absolute. With a calm, deliberate twist, a sickening snap echoed across the roof. The baton clattered to the ground. Conductor screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of agony. The cyan-eyed Deku didn't react to the scream. His expression was one of mild disinterest, as if analyzing a faulty piece of machinery. His other hand shot out, not in a punch, but with fingers stiffened like a spear. It jabbed into the side of Conductor's knee. Another wet, cracking sound. The villain's leg buckled, and he collapsed onto the roof, shrieking and clutching his ruined appendages. My quirk sight! He gasped, trying to focus his eyes on a piece of debris to use. A thick cloud of inky blackness, a perversion of smokescreen, instantly enveloped his head. It wasn't a gentle dispersal to obscure movement. It was a targeted, suffocating blanket of smoke forced directly into his eyes, nose, and mouth. Conductor choked, his hands flying to his face, blind and disoriented. The assault was relentless, methodical, and horrifyingly precise. A black whip tendril, now thick as a python, shot out and wrapped around the villain's remaining good leg. It squeezed. The sound of splintering bone was sharp and ugly in the sudden silence. Throughout the entire process, the thing that was Deku remained silent. There were no battle cries, no declarations of justice. There was only the sound of a body being systematically dismantled. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution, paused just shy of the final blow. The smokescreen dissipated. Conductor lay on the ground, a broken, whimpering heap. His right wrist was shattered. Both of his legs were mangled beyond recognition. He was neutralized. Permanently. He would never walk, let alone fight, again. The entity in Deku's body stood over him, its cyan eyes scanning the broken form with the detached air of a butcher inspecting a side of meat. It seemed to consider him for a moment longer, a flicker of something truly final crossing its features, before a sound broke its concentration. Deku-kun? The voice was small, trembling, and full of terror. The head turned slowly, the movement unnervingly smooth. It looked at Ochako Uraraka, who had pushed herself into a sitting position, her face ashen. She was staring at him, not with relief, but with the same horror she had looked at the villain with moments before. Her savior was more terrifying than her attacker. The friend she knew was gone, replaced by this cold, efficient monster. The cyan eyes regarded her for a long, silent moment. There was no recognition in them. No friendship. Only a cool, detached assessment. Assets secured. Threat neutralized. Moving to next objective. It was at that moment that two figures crested the edge of the ruined rooftop, having blasted and frozen their way through the lower floors. DKU! Katsuki Bakugo roared, his palms smoking from the effort of his ascent. Beside him, Shoto Todoroki's expression was a grim mask, his left side still steaming. They had felt the cataclysmic surge of power, and had come running. They froze. The scene before them was one of brutal carnage. The villain, conductor, was a mangled wreck, still conscious and sobbing in agony. Uraraka was pale and injured, looking at their friend as if he were a ghost. And Deku. He stood in the center of it all, the last vestiges of the unholy storm of one for all crackling around him. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with soot, but it was his expression that made their blood run cold. It was empty. There was no relief at having saved his friend. No exhaustion from the titanic explosion of power. No righteous anger. There was just nothing. A void. His head was cocked slightly, his cyan glowing eyes moving from the broken villain to the newly arrived students, calculating, assessing. They were not friends. They were variables. Potential threats. Uraraka called his name again, a desperate, broken whisper. Deku? He didn't turn. He didn't answer. He just stood there, a stranger wearing Izuku Midoriya's face, a terrifying testament to a legacy unchained. The ninth holder of One for All was gone, and something far older, and far more dangerous, was now in control. Consciousness returned not as a light switching on, but as a slow, muddy tide creeping back to shore. The first sensation was a smell, sharp, sterile, and aggressively clean. Antiseptic. The second was a sound, a quiet, rhythmic beeping, steady and serene. It was the soundtrack to his life, the familiar percussion of the Recovery Girls' infirmary. Izuku Midoriya's eyelids felt heavy as lead shutters. He peeled them open to a familiar sight, the acoustic tiles of the infirmary ceiling, stark white and perforated with a million tiny holes. He lay there for a long moment, adrift in the disorienting space between a nightmare and waking. The phantom sensations of the fight lingered, the acrid smell of smoke, the visceral terror for Ochako, the deafening roar in his ears as a dam of rage inside him had burst. Then, nothing. A black, gaping void in his memory. A chunk of his life, carved out and thrown away. He took a mental inventory, a practice routine honed by 100 self-inflicted injuries. He flexed his fingers. They obeyed. He wiggled his toes. They, too, moved without a whisper of pain. He tensed his arms, his legs, his core, bracing for the signature agony of shattered bones, torn ligaments, or the deep, thrumming ache of quirk overuse. There was nothing. Not a single twinge. That's not right, he thought, a profound sense of wrongness crawling over his skin. He pushed himself up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. He was still in the tattered remains of his hero costume, but he felt fine. Better than fine. He felt a thrum of latent energy beneath his skin, a coiled readiness that was entirely alien. He should be a wreck. After a release of power like the one he vaguely remembered, he should be in traction for a week. I broke my weight. The words tumbled out of his mouth on instinct, a familiar refrain of self-deprecation. But they died on his lips as the reality set in. I'm not broken. No, young Midoriya. You are not. The voice was heavy, weighed down with a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Deku's head snapped up. All Might was there, slumped in a visitor's chair, his skeletal form looking more fragile and brittle than ever before. His hands, thin and bony, were clasped so tightly together his knuckles were white. But it was his eyes, those deep-set blue eyes sunk into shadowed sockets, that held Deku captive. They weren't just worried. They were haunted. It was the look of a man who had seen a ghost walk out of its grave and wear the face of his beloved successor. Standing by the window, arms crossed, was Shota Aizawa. His expression was, as usual, an unreadable mask of stoicism, but the lack of his usual tired slouch, the rigid set of his shoulders, and the way his gaze drilled into Deku spoke volumes. This wasn't a teacher checking on an injured student. This was a warden observing a volatile and unpredictable threat. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder in the suffocating silence. All Might? Aizawa-sensei? Deku's voice was raspy. What happened? Is everyone okay? Is Uraraka-san? Uraraka is fine. Aizawa cut in, his tone flat and clipped. Recovery girl healed her leg. She'll be sore, but she'll make a full recovery. The rest of the class has been accounted for. The villains who breached the facility have been apprehended. A wave of relief so powerful it made Deku dizzy washed over him. Ochako was okay. Everyone was safe. He had done it. He had protected them. He sagged back against the cot, a shaky laugh escaping him. Oh, thank goodness. He ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair. I'm sorry. I lost control. I don't really remember what happened after I saw him target her. It's all a blur. I felt so angry. I pushed too hard again, didn't I? I'm so sore. I protected the asset. You were failing. The voice was not spoken aloud. It manifested directly inside his skull. A shard of ice slid into the core of his brain. It was cold, devoid of inflection, and resonated with chilling authority. It was not the familiar, warm presence of Nana Shimura or the encouraging whisper of Yoichi. This was something else. Something ancient, hard, and utterly ruthless. Deku flinched violently, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His hands flew to his head as if to physically claw the voice out. Who said that? He whispered, his eyes darting around the empty room. Aizawa's posture stiffened further. Said what, Midoriya? That voice. Deku stammered, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs, the monitor beside him picking up its frantic rhythm. In my head. It wasn't one of the others. All Might rose from his chair, his movements slow and pained. He looked at Aizawa, a silent, grim conversation passing between them. The symbol of peace, the man who had faced down All for One, looked deeply, truly afraid. Young Midoriya. All Might began, his voice barely a whisper. When you fought that villain, when you lost control, what did you see? What did you feel? Deku tried to grasp the memory, but it was like trying to catch smoke. He remembered the white-hot rage, the feeling of 1,000 dams breaking at once. And he remembered the power, not his power, but something wearing his skin, something that felt vast and cold, and utterly confident. I don't know, he confessed, his own voice sounding small and pathetic to his ears. It was like I was pushed into the back of my own mind. I was a passenger. There was someone else was in control. Aizawa pushed off from the window, his footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. He stopped a few feet from Deku's cot, his dark eyes narrowed in intense scrutiny. Who, Midoriya? Before Deku could answer, the cold voice echoed in his mind again, dripping with condescension. He asks for a name, but you don't even know what you carry. You are a child playing with a loaded cannon. Deku shuddered, wrapping his arms around himself. He felt exposed, violated. This was his mind, his quirk. It was supposed to be his. He shut his eyes, trying to retreat to the one place he could always find answers, the one sanctuary where he was the unquestioned master. He sank into himself, searching for the familiar, misty crossroads of the vestige realm. He found it. But it was no longer his sanctuary. The world within One for All was horrifyingly changed. The soft, ethereal mist that usually swirled around the seated figures of the previous holders was gone. The world was rendered in stark, brutal clarity, as if a harsh industrial light had been switched on. The ground was no longer an undefined plain but a floor of cracked, black obsidian that reflected a sky of cold, oppressive cyan. And the vestiges, they were changed too. Yoichi, Nana, Banjo, and they were all there, but they were faint, translucent, their forms flickering like dying embers. They were seated far in the distance, their expressions anxious and powerless. They looked like prisoners in their own shared soul. Only one figure was solid. He sat on a throne-like chair that seemed to be carved from the same black obsidian as the floor. It was a seat Deku had never seen before, a position of ultimate authority. The man occupying it was lean and tense, coiled like a spring. He wore the remnants of a bygone hero costume, dark, practical, high-collared body armor over a simple tunic, the kind of gear a soldier would wear, not a brightly colored symbol. His hair was spiky and light-colored, but it was his face that held Deku's attention. It was all sharp angles and hard lines, a face that had never known a day of peace. And his eyes glowed with the same terrifying, glacial cyan that Deku had seen reflected in a window pane just before he blacked out. This was him. The voice. The hijacker. "Who are you?" Deku demanded, his own internal voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. The man on the throne didn't stand. He simply tilted his head, his cyan eyes pinning Deku in place. He was the second user. The one All Might knew almost nothing about. The pragmatic lieutenant from the darkest era of All for One's reign. "I am the one who ensures the legacy survives." The second user's voice echoed, not through his mouth, but through the very fabric of the realm. "You were jeopardizing the mission. The vessel was about to be broken and the primary asset lost due to your emotional incompetence." "Asset? Vessel?" Deku repeated, the words tasting like poison. "She's my friend. Her name is Ochako Uraraka. She's a person." The second user made a dismissive gesture. "Her name is irrelevant. Her function in that moment was bait. The enemy used your attachment to her as a weapon against you, a weapon you were powerless to defend against. You froze. You panicked. You were about to watch her die because of your flawed, sentimental doctrine. I would have saved her." Deku shot back, taking a step forward. He felt an invisible wall of pressure push back against him. He was a guest here now, not the master. The second's expression remained unchanged. It was colder than any ice Todoroki could ever produce. "You would have failed. You would have launched a reckless, unfocused attack, shattered every bone in your body, and the enemy would have killed her while you lay helpless. I have seen your methods. They are inefficient. Wasteful. Suited for an era of peace and parades, not for war. And make no mistake, Ninth. We are at war." The scene around them flickered. For a gut-wrenching second, Deku saw it, the alternative. He saw himself, wreathed in green lightning, launching a desperate, screaming punch. He saw Conductor sidestep it with ease. He saw the invisible kinetic bullet strike Uraraka. He saw her fall. The image was so vivid, so real, he felt a scream build in his own throat. Then it was gone. He was back in the cyan-lit throne room, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his brow even in this mental space. What did you do to me?" Deku whispered, horrified. "I did what was necessary," the second stated, his voice flat. "I assumed direct control of the vessel to execute a more optimal strategy. Threat assessment. Tactical analysis. Systematic neutralization of the enemy's ability to fight. It was clean. Efficient. The asset was protected. The host's body sustained 0 damage. The enemy combatant was permanently removed as a future threat. By any logical metric, my intervention was a resounding success." You dismantled him," Deku stammered, the flashes of memory now returning, colored by the second's cold perspective. The snap of the wrist. The jab to the knee. The calculated, brutal precision. It wasn't a hero's work. It was an assassin's. You were going to kill him. His continued existence posed a threat to you and those you professed to protect. The logical course of action was to eliminate that threat. Your compunction against killing is a luxury born of a peaceful age, a luxury we can no longer afford. From the distance, another voice, warm and familiar, tried to break through. It was Nana Shimura. "He's a child, second. You can't force your war on him. A hero must save, not just destroy. That is the heart of what we do." The second user didn't even glance in her direction. "The heart is a pump," he stated coldly. "And sentiment is a fatal disease in our line of work. I carried this power when the world was burning, when All for One's shadow covered everything. We didn't have schools. We had battlefields. We didn't have captures. We had casualties. I will not stand by and watch this legacy, our only weapon against him, be squandered by a crying boy who hesitates at the final, most crucial moment." His cyan gaze intensified, feeling like a physical weight on Deku's soul. You are the ninth holder, Izuku Midoriya. But you are not its master. You are its current vessel, and if the pilot is inept, I will take the controls. I will not let you crash us into the ground. He raised a hand, and Deku felt a colossal, irresistible force shove him backwards. The obsidian throne room dissolved, the cyan light faded, and he was flung violently back into his own body. He gasped, his eyes flying open. He was back in the infirmary. Only a few seconds had passed. All Might and Aizawa were still staring at him, waiting for an answer to a question he could no longer remember. His skin was clammy, his heart monitor screeching a frantic, terrified rhythm. Recovery Girl chose that moment to bustle in, her lips pursed into a thin line as she glanced at the monitor. Goodness gracious, what did you two say to him? His heart rate is through the roof. She bustled over, shooing All Might away. Out. The boy is physically fine, which is a miracle in itself, but he clearly needs rest, not an interrogation. All Might looked like he wanted to argue, to stay, to offer some kind of comfort, but a sharp glance from Aizawa stopped him. The symbol of peace deflated, giving Deku one last look of profound, helpless sorrow before shuffling out of the room. Aizawa, however, did not leave. He waited until Recovery Girl was distracted with unhooking the monitor. His voice was low, barely audible. My office. 30 minutes, it wasn't a request. It was an order. With that, he turned and swept out of the room, his capture weapon trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. Deku sat alone on the cot, the steady beeping of the monitor now gone, leaving a silence that was even more terrifying. The stranger wasn't just in his head. He was a part of One for All, a part that had taken the wheel and was promising to do so again. I am the pilot now. The memory of those words sent a tremor of pure dread through him. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had saved so many people, the hands that had been broken and healed a dozen times over. But in his mind's eye, he saw them twisting a man's wrist until it snapped. He saw them jabbing into a knee with cold, anatomical precision. They didn't feel like his hands anymore. 30 minutes later, Deku stood outside the door to Shota Aizawa's office. He had changed into a spare PE uniform, but he still felt exposed, as if the tatters of his hero costume were a metaphor for his shredded sense of self. He took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird of his heart and knocked. Enter. Aizawa's office was as Spartan and practical as the man himself. A simple desk, a high-backed chair, a filing cabinet, and a large, state-of-the-art computer monitor that was currently dark. The only personal touch was a framed photo on the filing cabinet, turned away from view. The blinds were drawn, plunging the room into a dim twilight. Aizawa sat behind the desk, a thermos of what Deku assumed was coffee beside him. He gestured to the simple, uncomfortable chair opposite him. Deku sat, his back ramrod straight. He felt like a suspect in a police station. Aizawa took a long, slow sip from his thermos, his eyes never leaving Deku's face. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself, designed to unnerve and extract. Deku's hands were sweating. The voice in his head was silent for now, a lurking presence he could feel waiting in the wings. Finally, Aizawa spoke, his voice dangerously soft. I'm going to ask you again, Midoriya. And I want you to think very carefully before you answer. What happened on that roof? Deku's throat was dry. Honesty. That was all he had. It was the foundation of his relationship with All Might, with all his teachers. Sensei, I can't explain it. There's a part of my quirk, of One for All. The previous users, their consciousnesses are inside it. They're like vestiges. He was breaking his promise to All Might, but what choice did he have? The secret was already out of the bag, rampaging and breaking bones. Aizawa's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, understanding perhaps, passed through his eyes. Vestiges. Go on. Usually they're just there. Supportive. But this time, one of them took over. Completely. He said I was failing, that my hesitation was going to get Uraraka-san killed. He used my body to fight. The confession felt like treason, an admission of a fundamental failure that went beyond just breaking his bones. He had failed to control himself. Aizawa leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. This vestige. Did he seem familiar? No. He was different. Colder. He called her an asset. He called me a vessel. He said he was from a time of war and that my way of being a hero is a liability. Aizawa was quiet for a long moment, processing. I see, he said, the two words carrying an immense weight. He turned to the large monitor on his desk and tapped a key. It flickered to life. The USJ has over 500 security cameras. Most were disabled in the initial blast. But one, on a light pole across from your training zone, survived. Its audio sensors were fried, but the visual feed is intact. I want you to watch this with me. He clicked the mouse. The screen lit up with a grainy, wide-angle shot of the ruined building. Deku could see his own small figure and Uraraka's. He saw Conductor. He watched the initial confrontation, the deflected girder, the telekinetic blasts. He saw Uraraka get injured, saw her leg pinned. He felt the phantom rage bubble up in his chest again just watching it, and then he saw himself scream. The footage distorted. The camera lens seemed to warp as a silent, violent explosion of green and black energy erupted from his on-screen self. It was far more terrifying to watch from the outside, a raw, elemental force of nature being uncaged. This, Aizawa said, pausing the video on the frame of pure chaos, is you losing control. It's reckless. Dangerous. Consistent with your previous record. He unpaused it. The chaos on screen receded in a split second, coalescing around Deku's form. And then, the shift. His on-screen self stood up straight. The frenetic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by an eerie, predatory stillness. And this, Aizawa whispered, his voice laced with a grim awe, is something else entirely. He let the footage play. He watched the thing wearing his face evade Conductor's attack not by reacting, but by anticipating. He saw the instantaneous movement, the brutal, efficient twist of the wrist, the precise jab to the knee. He saw the targeted use of smokescreen not as cover, but as a sensory deprivation weapon. Deku felt sick. His stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on his neck. The person on that screen was a stranger. A cold-blooded, terrifyingly competent monster. He watched as the figure dismembered Conductor's other leg, the movements fluid, economical, and utterly devoid of mercy. Aizawa paused the footage again. The frame was frozen on the cyanide Deku standing over his broken foe. Look at your stance, Midoriya, Aizawa said, using his mouse cursor to circle the figure's feet. Perfectly balanced. Center of gravity low. Ready to move in any direction. That's not your brawling stance. That's the stance of a seasoned martial artist. He moved the cursor to the figure's head. You're not even breathing heavily. After an output of power that should have leveled the block, your posture indicates perfect cardiovascular control. You're not angry. You're not triumphant. You're assessing. He rewound the footage a few seconds. Here. Conductor launches a piece of the satellite dish at you. You don't even look at it. Why? Because you've already identified him as the source of the attack. You know his quirk requires line of sight and a gesture. By closing the distance and disabling his hands, you render his primary weapon useless before he can even use it again. This wasn't a reckless charge, Midoriya. This was a calculated decapitation strike. Deku stared at the screen, his own face looking back at him with those alien, Arctic blue eyes. The voice of the second user echoed in his memory. Clean. Efficient. Optimal. That's not me, Deku whispered, shaking his head in denial. I wouldn't. I couldn't do that. The evidence suggests otherwise, Aizawa stated, his voice hard as stone. He let the footage play to the end, showing the arrival of Bakugo and Todoroki, the long, chilling moment where the cyanide Deku assessed them as new variables. Then, Aizawa leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. For over a year, I have watched you fight. You are reckless, emotional, and self-destructive. You lead with your heart, and your bones pay the price. You have immense power that you struggle to control. But the person in this video? He has absolute, perfect control. The power is not a flood, it's a scalpel. He uses your quirks in ways you haven't even conceived of yet. He leveled a heavy, tired gaze at Deku. There was no hesitation. No mercy. Every move was designed to inflict maximum damage and permanently disable. You weren't aiming to subdue, you were systematically dismembering him. My question for you, Midoriya, the one I need you to answer honestly, is this: if Bakugo and Todoroki hadn't arrived, what would your next move have been? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Deku didn't have an answer, because he knew, deep in his gut, what the second user's answer would have been. Eliminate the threat. The silence was his confession. Aizawa sighed, the sound containing the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. I believe you, Midoriya. I believe that you weren't in control, and that, frankly, is far more terrifying than if you had simply lost your temper. It means that One for All is not just your quirk. It's a passenger. Or, in this case, a hijacker. It means the most powerful student at this school, the successor to the symbol of peace, is a ticking time bomb with an unknown person's finger on the trigger. The trust between them, built on shared battles and quiet respect, wasn't just fractured. It was shattered. In its place was a chasm of professional duty and cold, hard risk assessment. Until I understand what this vestige is and how to prevent this from happening again, you are a security risk, Aizawa said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Effective immediately, you are on probationary status. You will attend classes, you will participate in basic training, but you are forbidden from engaging in any combat exercise without my direct supervision and authorization. You will not, under any circumstances, patrol or leave campus for hero work. Your quirk is to be considered a loaded weapon with a faulty safety. We don't know the trigger, and we don't know the intent of the one pulling it. Until we do, you are a liability to your classmates, your teachers, and yourself. He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. I am not doing this to punish you, problem child. I am doing this to protect everyone from you. Am I understood? Deku could only nod, a lump of ice lodged in his throat. He understood all too well. He was a danger. A monster slept inside him, and it had woken up. You're dismissed, Aizawa said, turning back to the monitor and closing the video file. Deku stood up on shaky legs and walked to the door. As his hand touched the doorknob, he glanced back. Aizawa hadn't moved, his back still to him. Deku walked out, closing the door softly behind him. He stood in the empty, dimly lit hallway, the silence of the school at night pressing in on him. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of a classroom window. He saw his own familiar, messy green hair, his freckles, his wide, tear-prone green eyes. But as he stared, he could almost see them flicker. A flash of cold, brilliant cyan. A stranger's eyes staring back from his own face. The stranger in the mirror. He wasn't alone in his own body anymore. And he had no idea how to get it back. The walk from Aizawa's office to the Heights Alliance dormitory was the longest 10 minutes of Izuku Midoriya's life. Each step echoed in the silent, cavernous hallways of UA after hours. The familiar path, usually bustling with the energy of his peers, felt like a green mile. He was a prisoner being transferred, not from one cell to another, but from a formal interrogation into a holding pen filled with the people he was now officially considered a danger to. Probationary status. A security risk. A liability. Aizawa's words were a brand on his soul. They weren't spoken with malice, which somehow made them worse. They were cold, hard facts. A logical assessment from a man who dealt in nothing else. Deku couldn't even argue. He had seen the footage. He had met the stranger wearing his face. The voice of the second user was mercifully silent, but its presence was a constant, oppressive weight in the back of his mind. A cold spot. A silent observer judging his every move. Deku found himself walking with a strange, stiff precision, hyper-aware of the placement of his feet, the swing of his arms. He was consciously trying to move like himself, and the effort was exhausting, a constant, low-grade panic that he might slip and move with the terrifying economy he'd seen on that screen. As he approached the dormitory, the distant, muffled sounds of life grew louder. Laughter. The faint, bass-heavy beat of a video game. The smell of something sweet and buttery, Sato's stress baking, no doubt, wafted through the air. These were the sounds and smells of home, the comforting backdrop to his new life as a UA student. Tonight they sounded like a party he wasn't invited to, a world he no longer belonged in. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. He hesitated for a full 10 seconds, his forehead resting against the cool wood of the door. He could just turn around. Sleep in a training room. Avoid this. But Aizawa's order was implicit, return to the dorms. He was to be observed. Contained. This was part of his sentence. With a deep, shaky breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The common room was alive. Kaminari, Siro, and Ishido were sprawled on the couches, controllers in hand, engaged in a loud and vibrant racing game. Sato was indeed pulling a tray of cookies from the oven, the warm scent filling the space. Yaoyorozu and Jiro were chatting quietly at the dining table over a cup of tea. It was a scene of perfect, blissful normalcy, and the moment Deku stepped inside, it shattered. The first to notice was Jiro. Her earphone jacks, which had been lazily tracing patterns on the table, twitched and aimed in his direction like a startled cat's ears. Her eyes widened slightly. The conversation with Yaoyorozu died on her lips. One by one, like a chain reaction of dominoes, the others fell silent. Ishido's joyful whoop as she crossed the finish line choked in her throat. Kaminari fumbled his controller, the plastic clattering loudly on the floor. The cheerful music from the video game was the only sound left, an awkward, tinny soundtrack to the sudden, suffocating tension. Every eye in the room was on him. Deku felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He tried to smile, to offer some kind of reassurance, but his facial muscles felt frozen. He settled for a weak, almost inaudible. "I'm back." Tenya Ida, ever the class representative, was the first to break the spell. He shot up from his seat, his hand chopping the air in his signature gesture, but it was stiffer than usual, the movement lacking its usual crisp conviction. "Midoriya-kun! It is good to see you have been discharged from Recovery Girl's care." His voice was loud, overly formal, a desperate attempt to paper over the gaping hole in the room's atmosphere. "We were all most concerned for your well-being." "Thanks, Ida-kun," Deku managed, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor just past Ida's feet. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He was terrified of what he might see there. Fear? Pity? Accusation? He was even more terrified of what they might see in his. Kirishima, bless his earnest heart, tried next. He slid off the couch, a forced, slightly too wide grin stretched across his face. "Hey, Midoriya! Good to see you're up and around, man. You had us worried there for a minute." He took a step forward, his hand raised as if to clap Deku on the shoulder, but he stopped short, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air for a second before dropping back to his side. The friendly, physical contact that defined their friendship was suddenly a barrier he was unwilling to cross. The gesture, or lack thereof, was more damning than any accusation. It was a physical manifestation of the new chasm between them. "Yeah," Deku mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "Sorry for worrying you." The silence descended again, heavier this time. Kaminari was pretending to be intensely interested in the scuff marks on his sneakers. Ishido was fidgeting, twisting a lock of her pink hair. Even Sato just stood by the oven, holding the tray of cookies, his usual offer of a treat dying on his lips. They had all seen the footage. Aizawa would have shown them. It was standard protocol after a villain attack, a debriefing to analyze what went right and what went wrong. They had seen him save Uraraka, and they had seen how he had done it. They had seen the cold, efficient dismantling. They had seen the monster. From the corner of his eye, Deku saw movement. Bakugo was leaning against the far wall, near the hallway to the elevators, arms crossed. He hadn't said a word. He was just watching, his crimson eyes narrowed into analytical slits. There was no fear in his gaze. There was something else, a furious, simmering intensity. He wasn't looking at Deku like a monster. He was looking at him like a complex problem he was furiously determined to solve. Beside him, Todoroki was equally silent, his heterochromatic eyes holding a different kind of intensity. It was a quiet, piercing concern. He, more than anyone, knew what it was like when overwhelming power went out of control, when it was used to hurt and dominate. He was looking at Deku with a kind of sad, knowing empathy that was almost as painful as the fear from the others. Deku knew he had to escape. The walls of the common room were closing in, the weight of 20 pairs of eyes pressing down on him. I'm kind of tired," He lied, his voice strained. I think I'm just going to go to my room. He started to move, his steps quick and desperate, aiming for the elevators. Each footfall felt like a drumbeat in the silent room. Thud. 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 He could feel their gazes tracking him, a physical weight on his back. He was almost there, almost to the safety of the hallway. Well, well, well! If it isn't Class 1 as star pupil, fresh from another one of his famous temper tantrums. The voice was like nails on a chalkboard, oozing with condescending glee. It cut through the tension like a poison knife. Nito Monoma stood in the entryway to the Class 1B dorms, which connected via a short corridor. He leaned against the doorframe, a smirk plastered on his face. Kendo was behind him, holding a stack of textbooks and rolling her eyes in exasperation. Monoma, stop it! She sighed. We just came to return these to Yayarozu. But Monoma was already on a roll, his eyes gleaming with malicious opportunity. He pushed off the doorframe and sauntered into the common room, his theatrical swagger soaking up the tense atmosphere like a sponge. I heard all about it, of course, he declared, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Another villain attack, and who's at the center of the collateral damage? Izuku Midoriya. Truly, your consistency is almost admirable. But this time was different, wasn't it? I heard you didn't even break a single bone. He circled Deku like a shark, his smirk widening. Deku stood frozen, his head bowed, fists clenched at his sides. He just wanted to disappear. Ignore him, Deku pleaded with himself. Just walk away. Don't engage. Don't give him anything. No shattered limbs. Monoma continued, tapping a finger to his chin in mock contemplation. Just a villain who was, according to the whispers, systematically dismantled. Sounds a bit unheroic, doesn't it? Almost sounds like something a villain would do. Tell me, Midoriya, how can you ever hope to be a real hero when you're so clearly your own worst villain? The barb hit its mark. It wasn't just a taunt about his power, it was an echo of Aizawa's assessment, a confirmation of Deku's deepest, darkest fear. Deku flinched, a small, wounded sound escaping his lips. He started to stammer his usual flustered defense. That's not. I didn't, you don't understand. It was exactly the reaction Monoma wanted. He laughed, a high, grating sound. Oh, I think I understand perfectly. You're unstable. A liability. All that power, and you can't even control your own. Insignificant. The words sliced through Deku's stammering, spoken not from his mouth, but by the cold voice in his head. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a clear, ringing command, and with it came a sensation like being plunged into ice water. The frantic hummingbird of Deku's heart didn't just slow, it stopped its panicked flutter and began to beat with a slow, heavy, metronomic rhythm. The heat of his shame vanished, replaced by an arctic calm. The fuzzy, overwhelming emotions of fear and anxiety were muted, switched off as if by a remote control. The world, which had been a confusing blur of social cues and painful glances, sharpened into crystalline, high-definition focus. He could see the subtle tells in Monoma's posture, the slight forward lean of someone overcompensating, the way his eyes darted to the other students, checking to see if his audience was appreciating the show. He could smell the faint, bitter scent of Kendo's exasperated sweat. He could hear the almost imperceptible tremor in Kaminari's breathing. He lifted his head. For a single, terrifying instant, his eyes flickered from emerald green to glacial cyan. It was so fast, most wouldn't have registered it. But Jiro, who was watching him with auditory focus, gasped. Bakugo, whose eyes had never left him, straightened up from the wall, his own eyes widening in shock and a dawning, furious understanding. Todoroki's breath hitched. Deku's expression was blank. The flustered, apologetic boy was gone. In his place was the stranger from the video. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move a muscle. He simply spoke, his tone quiet, conversational, and utterly chilling. Your entire identity, Deku said, his voice a low, level monotone, is a reflection of the strength of others. Your quirk copy is parasitic by nature. It is wholly dependent on the abilities of those you profess to despise. Without us, without Class 1A, without heroes more powerful than you to emulate, you are nothing. You have no power of your own, Monoma's smirk faltered. The words, delivered with such calm, surgical precision, had struck a nerve far deeper than any of his taunts. The cyan-tinged Deku took a half-step forward. The movement was fluid, silent, and predatory. Monoma flinched back instinctively. You project your own feelings of inadequacy onto our class because acknowledging your own inherent mediocrity is a truth you cannot bear. The cold voice continued, using Deku's mouth as its instrument. Your obsession with us is not a rivalry. It is a desperate, pathetic cry for relevance. But you will never be relevant. You are a footnote in the story of better men. The final blow was delivered with the quiet finality of a judge passing sentence. And a footnote's shouting is just silence, dead air. The entire common room was frozen in a state of collective shock. They had seen Deku angry. They had seen him determined. They had seen him cry. They had never, ever seen him be cruel. This wasn't a comeback. It was a vivisection. He had taken Nito Monoma's entire personality, his driving motivation, and had dissected it on the floor for everyone to see, leaving it exposed as something weak and pitiful. Monoma stood there, his face completely drained of color. His mouth was slightly open, but no sound came out. The smug glee in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, naked shock. He looked smaller somehow, defeated. Kendo, her face a mask of horror, stepped forward and grabbed Monoma's arm. Her own quirk-enlarged hand was trembling. Nito, she whispered, her voice cracking. Let's go. Now, she had to physically pull him, guiding his stumbling, unresponsive form out of the common room. He didn't resist. He just stared blankly ahead, the devastating words still echoing in the space he had vacated. The moment they were gone, the ice-water shock in Deku's veins receded. The warmth of his own blood returned with a nauseating rush. The emotions he'd been shielded from came flooding back, fear, shame, and now, a profound wave of horror at what he had just done. The second user's voice whispered in his mind, laced with something that might have been grim satisfaction. Verbal threats must be met with psychological dominance. He will not challenge this vessel again. Deku's stomach lurched. He felt like he was going to be sick. He looked at the faces of his classmates. The fear and confusion were still there, but now they were mixed with a new, more potent emotion, alarm. They had just witnessed a glimpse of the cold, tactical mind from the video, and it had been directed at one of their peers. People started making excuses, their voices quiet and strained. I'm gonna go finish that homework, Kaminari mumbled, practically bolting for the elevator. Yeah, me too, Ashido squeaked, following close behind. Sato, those cookies smell done, Siro said, helping the still-frozen baker move the tray to the counter before making his own hasty retreat. Within a minute, the bustling common room was nearly empty. Only a few remained. Bakugo and Todoroki, still watching from the periphery. Ida, who looked utterly lost, his rulebook having no chapter for this, and Ochako Uraraka. She stood near the kitchen counter, her hands clasped in front of her. Her face was pale, and her big, brown eyes were wide with a mixture of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher: hurt, fear, concern, and a desperate, searching hope. She took a tentative step towards him, her footsteps seeming to echo in the now silent room. Deku-kun? Her voice was soft, gentle, the one voice in the world that had always been a source of unconditional comfort. Now, it was a trigger. It was the sound that had preceded the fracture. He flinched back as if she had struck him. Don't, he whispered, his own voice hoarse. She stopped, her expression crumbling. I wanted to see if you were okay, she said, her voice trembling. You saved me. I never got to thank you. Don't thank me, he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her kind, worried face, he was afraid the cold thing inside him would surface again, seeing her not as a friend, but as an asset to be managed. She took another small step. What's wrong? You can talk to me. Please. You're scaring me. She reached a hand out, her fingers just inches from his arm, a simple, grounding gesture of friendship. The proximity, the earnestness of her plea, the memory of her cry of pain on that rooftop, it all coalesced into a perfect storm of panic in Deku's mind. And through that panic, The second's voice slithered, cold and possessive. Attachments are weaknesses. She was a liability you failed to protect. I will not fail. The implication was horrifying. I will not fail. It meant the second user would take control to protect her. He would use his cold, brutal methods. He would hurt people, maybe even kill people, in her name. And it would be Deku's body, his face, his quirk that did it. He would become the monster to keep her safe. A raw, primal terror seized him. The only way to protect her from the monster was to keep it away from her. And the monster was him. He recoiled from her touch as if her hand were made of white-hot iron. Stay away from me! He choked out, his voice cracking with a desperate agony. The hurt on Uraraka's face was instantaneous and devastating. Her hand fell to her side. Her eyes filled with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall. She looked at him, her best friend, the boy who had inspired her from day one, and saw a stranger pushing her away with a cruelty he had never before possessed. He couldn't bear to see that look on her face for another second. Without another word, Deku turned and fled. He sprinted past Bakugo and Todoroki, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from Todoroki and Bakugo's quiet, venomous curse. He jabbed the elevator button with more force than necessary, and the moment the doors opened, he threw himself inside, pressing the button for his floor repeatedly until the doors mercifully slid shut, cutting off the image of Ochako Uraraka standing alone and heartbroken in the middle of the empty common room. The chasm between them had just become a canyon. He burst into his own room, the door slamming shut behind him. His sanctuary? The room was a monument to his lifelong dream, every wall covered in the smiling, triumphant face of All Might. The posters, the figurines, the limited edition bedsheets, they had always been a source of comfort and inspiration. Tonight, they felt like accusations. The number one hero's confident, beaming smile seemed to mock him. Can you be a hero who saves everyone with a smile? The question echoed in his mind. He had just made his best friend cry. He had psychologically eviscerated a classmate. He had a killer's instincts lurking inside his soul. He stumbled to the small mirror over his desk. He stared at his reflection, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Green hair. Freckles. Wide, green eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. It was his face. It was Izuku Midoriya's face. But as he stared, heart pounding, he thought he saw it again. A trick of the light, a phantom of his overwrought imagination, a flicker. For less than a heartbeat, his own tear-filled green eyes were gone, replaced by a pair of cold, calculating, and utterly unforgiving cyan orbs. A stranger stared back at him from the mirror. Deku cried out and stumbled back, tripping over an All Might dumbbell and crashing to the floor. He scrambled away from the mirror, pressing himself into the corner of his room, pulling his knees to his chest. He was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that racked his entire body. The cracks weren't just forming in his class. The deepest, most terrifying fracture was right here, inside him. He was no longer just fighting villains. He was fighting for control of his own body, his own soul. And he was terrifyingly, utterly alone. The silence of midnight was a suffocating blanket over the UA campus. For Izuku Midoriya, sleep was a foreign country he no longer had a passport for. His room, once a sanctuary of heroic inspiration, had become a prison cell. The ever-smiling face of All Might on his poster seemed to watch him with accusing eyes, the bright primary colors a stark contrast to the gray dread that had settled deep in his bones. He had spent the last 2 days in a self-imposed exile, a ghost haunting the edges of Class 1A. He attended classes, his pen scratching mechanically across notebooks, absorbing nothing. He ate his meals quickly and alone, finding a deserted corner of the cafeteria and forcing down food that tasted like ash. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him constantly. Their hushed conversations would die the moment he entered a room. He saw the hurt in Uraraka's eyes every time she looked at him, a fresh wound he had inflicted. He saw the confusion on Ida's face, the pity in Kirishima's. They were walking on eggshells around him, treating him like a piece of unexploded ordnance. The worst part was the quiet. The second user hadn't spoken since the incident with Monoma, but his presence was a constant, a cold pressure at the base of Deku's skull, a silent passenger watching his every move. Deku was terrified of it, of what might trigger its reappearance. A stray emotion? A moment of stress? A kind word from a friend? He was so afraid of the monster inside him that he was starving himself of every connection, every emotion that made him him. He had to do something. He couldn't live like this. Aizawa's words echoed in his mind, a loaded weapon with a faulty safety. He had to learn how to fix the safety. He had to regain control. Tonight, he couldn't take the suffocating stillness of his room anymore. He needed to move, to burn off the frantic, buzzing energy under his skin. He needed to feel the familiar burn of One for All, to prove to himself that it was still his. Slipping out of the dorms was easy. A quick use of float from his balcony to the ground below, and he was cloaked in the campus's nocturnal shadows. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of cut grass and night-blooming flowers. Under normal circumstances, it would have been peaceful. Tonight, every rustling leaf sounded like a threat. He made his way to Training Gym Gamma, the industrial wasteland of pipes and concrete pillars nicknamed the Factory of Sadness by the students. It was perfect. Isolated. No one would be here at this hour. The massive metal doors hissed open at the touch of his student ID, and he slipped inside, the doors sliding shut behind him with a heavy, sealing finality. The cavernous space was lit only by emergency lights, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. The air was cold and smelled of dust and metal. It was a perfect reflection of how he felt inside, vast, empty, and haunted. He walked to the center of the gym, took a deep breath, and tried to activate his quirk. One for all. Full cowling. 5%. The familiar green lightning should have wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. Instead, it sputtered. It flickered erratically, like a faulty neon sign, arcing painfully at his joints before fizzling out. He tried again, focusing his will, pushing the power through his veins. This time, something different happened. Fine, black tendrils erupted from his right arm, not with the controlled precision he'd been so proud of, but in a chaotic, angry swarm. They whipped through the air, lashing out like enraged snakes, smashing against a nearby concrete pillar with enough force to send spiderweb cracks racing across its surface. No! Deku gasped, clutching his arm. He hadn't called for Black Whip. He had been focusing on the core of One for All. He tried to retract the tendrils, to pull them back into himself, but they resisted. They writhed and strained, pulling against his will, infused with a malevolent energy that wasn't his. It felt like the second user was in the code of the quirk itself, corrupting it, twisting it. Your control is an illusion. The voice whispered in his mind, no longer a clear command but a sibilant, mocking echo. This power is too vast for a sentimental child. Let go. Let me handle it. Get out of my head! Deku screamed, the words echoing in the huge, empty gym. He squeezed his eyes shut, pouring every ounce of his willpower into reining in the rogue quirk. This is my power! The tendrils thrashed violently, one of them whipping back and catching him across the cheek, the impact like a leather strap. It didn't break the skin, but it stung, a physical manifestation of his own power turning against him. He stumbled back, breathing heavily, sweat and tears of frustration mingling on his face. He was losing. He was losing the fight for his own body. He was so consumed by his internal battle, so lost in the desperate struggle, that he didn't hear the gym doors hiss open again. He didn't hear the soft, deliberate footsteps on the concrete floor. Having a little trouble there, you damn nerd? The voice was a rasp of gravel and gunpowder. It cut through Deku's panic like a thunderclap. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Leaning against a massive pipe across the gym, silhouetted by the dim emergency lighting, was Katsuki Bakugo. He was in his sleep sweats, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His expression wasn't angry, not in the explosive way Deku was used to. It was a low, simmering burn. He looked like he'd been waiting. Keikaken? Deku stammered, frantically trying to pull the thrashing black whip tendrils back into his arm. They finally, reluctantly, receded, melting back into his skin. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same damn question. Bakugo shot back, pushing off the pipe and starting to walk towards him. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Been watching you for 2 days. Moping around like a kicked puppy. scaring the hell out of Round Face and the other extras. Thought I'd follow you tonight and see what kind of pity party you were throwing for yourself. Deku flinched at the mention of Uraraka. He looked away, his gaze falling to the floor. I'm not. I'm just training. Bullshit. Bakugo spat. The word was sharp, definitive. He stopped about 15 feet away, his crimson eyes boring into Deku. You call that training? It looked like you were trying to wrestle an octopus, and the octopus was winning. That little light show you put on back at the USJ, and that cold as ice bullshit you pulled on Ponytail's loudmouth friend. That wasn't you, Deku. Bakugo took another step closer, his voice dropping, losing its usual explosive volume and taking on a dangerous, focused intensity. That was something else. I saw your eyes. I saw how you moved. I've spent my entire life watching you, you useless stalker. I know every move you've got before you even make it. And that wasn't one of yours. He pointed a finger at Deku, the gesture like the barrel of a gun. All Might told me the basics of how this stupid quirk works. He said it was a stockpile. He didn't say anything about it coming with ghosts, so you're going to start talking. Right now. What the hell is going on with One for All? Deku stared at him, his mind reeling. He had expected mockery. He had expected taunts, insults, a declaration that he was too weak to handle his own power. He had not expected this raw, demanding, almost clinical interrogation. Bakugo wasn't looking at him with fear or pity. He was looking at him with a mixture of burning anger and an unnerving, focused recognition. He wasn't afraid of the monster. He was pissed off at it for squatting in his rival's body. And in that moment, the dam broke. The loneliness, the fear, the crushing weight of the secret, the horror of his own actions, it all came pouring out. I can't control it, Kakin! The words burst out of him, a ragged, desperate sob. It's not a ghost, it's one of them. The vestiges. The past users. He's in my head! Bakugo's eyes widened slightly, the only sign of his surprise. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his intense gaze unwavering. When that villain was going to hurt Uraraka, Deku continued, his voice cracking, I got so angry, and it was like a door opened. And he came through. The second user. All Might doesn't know anything about him, only that he was from a brutal, terrible time. He took over. He said I was weak, a liability. He said my way of being a hero would get everyone killed. He sank to his knees, his whole body trembling with the force of his confession. He was the one who fought Conductor. He was the one who said those things to Monomakun. It's his voice in my head, telling me to be ruthless, telling me attachments are weaknesses. He sees everyone as assets and threats. He wants to eliminate threats. Permanently. He looked up at Bakugo, his eyes swimming with tears. He was laying his soul bare to the one person who had tormented him for most of his life, because there was no one else. No one else knew the secret. No one else could possibly understand. I'm scared, Kakin, he whispered, the admission costing him everything. I'm scared of what he'll do. I'm scared he'll hurt someone. I'm scared I'll never get him out. He's stronger than me. In my own mind, he's stronger. The confession hung in the cold, dusty air of the gym. Deku braced himself for the explosion. For the mockery. See? I told you were just a useless Deku. You can't even handle the power you stole. But the explosion didn't come. Bakugo was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He just stood there, processing the deluge of impossible information. Ghosts in a quirk. A mental hijacker from a bygone era. A killer instinct squatting in the mind of the most pathologically heroic person he had ever known. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low growl, stripped of its usual bravado and filled with something else. A harsh, gritty resolve. So you've got a parasite living in your quirk. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. A brutally blunt, perfectly Bakugo summary of the entire horrifying situation. Deku flinched at the word parasite but could only nod, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Bakugo scoffed, a short, sharp, humorless sound. He walked over and stood looking down at Deku, his shadow falling over his kneeling form. And what? You're just going to kneel here and cry about it. Let some dusty old fossil drive your body around like a stolen car? I don't know what to do, Deku cried out. I tried to fight him, but he's too strong. He twists everything. He showed me Uraraka dying because I was weak. He almost made me believe he was right. Bakugo's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Right? That bastard thinks breaking people is right? That's not strength. That's just being a psycho with a good excuse. He crouched down, forcing Deku to meet his gaze. His crimson eyes were blazing with a fire Deku had never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was the fierce, proprietary fury of someone seeing their chosen rival, their ultimate benchmark, being defiled by an outside force. Listen to me, you damn nerd! Bakugo snarled, jabbing a finger into Deku's chest. You got this power from All Might. You bled for it. You broke every bone in your body 100 times over learning how to use it. It's yours. You think I've been busting my ass every single day, trying to surpass you, just so you can get taken over by some ancient asshole with a god complex? Hell no. The raw, unexpected validation hit Deku like a physical blow. Bakugo wasn't just acknowledging his struggle. He was framing it in the context of their rivalry. He was angry on Deku's behalf, not because he cared about Deku's feelings, but because this interloper was cheating. It was messing with the dynamic, with the unspoken race to the top that defined their entire relationship. So you've got a parasite, Bakugo repeated, his voice dropping even lower. Then you fight it. You don't curl up in a ball and let it win. You get in its face, and you kick its ass until it knows who's boss. You hear me? Deku stared at him, speechless. This wasn't sympathy. This wasn't a gentle hand on the shoulder. This was abrasive. It was aggressive. It was pure, unfiltered Bakugo. And it was, bizarrely, exactly what he needed to hear. He didn't need pity. He needed a drill sergeant. And if you can't do it, Bakugo continued, his voice a low, dangerous promise, then I'll do it for you. I'll beat it out of you myself. I will drag the real you kicking and screaming back to the driver's seat if I have to. Because I'm not losing to some cheap copy. I'm going to be number one, and that means I have to beat you. The real you. The sniveling, self-sacrificing, bone-breaking idiot. Not this cold, dead-eyed freak. A new pact was being forged between them in the cold, dusty darkness of the gym. It wasn't born of friendship, not in the traditional sense. It was an alliance of necessity, a partnership built on the jagged, complex bedrock of their lifelong rivalry. Bakugo, as the only other person on the planet who knew the secret of One for All, felt a twisted, undeniable sense of ownership over the problem. It was his rival, his power, and therefore, his problem to fix. Get up, Bakugo ordered, standing and jerking his head towards the center of the gym. Deku, still processing the sheer whiplash of the conversation, slowly, shakily, got to his feet. What? You heard me. Get up, Bakugo repeated, already starting to stretch his arms, small pops of explosions crackling harmlessly in his palms. You said you can't control it. Fine. Then we train until you can, right here. Right now. You and me. You're going to activate your quirk, and you're going to try and hit me. And you're going to focus on keeping that son of a bitch in his cage. Deku's eyes widened in alarm. Kaken, no! I can't! What if he comes out? I could really hurt you! Bakugo stopped stretching and turned to him with a feral grin, a flash of the old, arrogant Kaken that was both terrifying and, in this moment, strangely reassuring. Let him try. He dared, slamming a fist into his open palm, creating a sharp boom that echoed through the gym. I'd like to meet the bastard. For the first time in days, a tiny spark ignited in the cold, dark pit of Deku's stomach. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something fiercer. It was defiance. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had an unlikely, explosive, and terrifyingly motivated confidant. He looked at Bakugo, at the challenge blazing in his crimson eyes, at the explosions flickering in his palms. He took a deep breath, the air still tasting of dust and metal, but now it felt charged with potential. Okay, Deku said, his voice quiet but firm. He wiped the last of the tears from his face. Okay, Kaken. He settled into his fighting stance, the one that was truly his, a little clumsy, a little too wide, but filled with his own desperate resolve. He focused, drawing on the core of his power, feeling the familiar warmth bubble up. The cold presence of the second user was still there, watching, waiting. But now, it wasn't the only other presence in the room. There was also the burning, explosive certainty of Katsuki Bakugo, a shield. A whetstone. An ally. Green lightning, steadier this time, began to crackle around him. The fight for his soul had just begun, and he finally had someone in his corner. The air in Jim Gamma crackled with a tension that was part electrical, part psychological. The pact had been made, the challenge issued. Now came the test. All right, Deku, Bakugo growled, his body settling into a low, predatory crouch. His palms faced forward, emitting a faint, smoky scent of nitroglycerin. 5%. That's it. You just try and land a single clean hit on me. And you focus on keeping your head straight. If I see even a flicker of those freaky blue eyes, I'm putting you through a wall. Got it, Deku replied, his voice tight. He took a deep breath, trying to find the calm, meditative state All Might had taught him. But it was impossible. His mind wasn't a placid lake. It was a churning sea with a leviathan lurking in its depths. He activated full cowling. The green lightning sputtered again, inconsistent and wild. He could feel the second user's influence like static in the connection, a corruption in the code of his own power. This is a pointless exercise. The voice slithered into his thoughts, cold and dismissive. A primitive dominance ritual. Your rival is an emotional, explosive brute. He is predictable. His aggression is his greatest weakness. Shut up, Deku muttered under his breath, shaking his head to clear it. Bakugo's eyes narrowed. What did you say? Nothing! Deku yelped, then refocused. Just getting ready, he lunged. It was a standard opening move, a feint to the left followed by a quick jab. But his body felt sluggish, his movements clumsy. He was so terrified of losing control, so focused on suppressing the second user, that his own fighting instincts were throttled. Bakugo sidestepped the jab with contemptuous ease. He didn't even counter, just let Deku's momentum carry him past. Too slow. You're thinking too much. Stop worrying about the parasite, and start worrying about the explosion about to hit your face. To punctuate the point, Bakugo spun and unleashed a small, controlled blast from his palm. It wasn't a full-power AP shot, just a concussive burst of hot air that caught Deku in the back and sent him stumbling forward. I can't! Deku grunted, righting himself. Every time I try to access my power, I can feel him. It's like he's right there, waiting to grab the wheel, so don't let him. Bakugo roared, blasting off the ground and coming at Deku from above. It's your damn car. You think I let my quirk boss me around? My sweat builds up, wants to pop off. I decide when and where. It's control. Stop being a passenger. Deku dodged the aerial assault, the heat from Bakugo's explosions washing over him. He could feel a spike of frustration building. Bakugo was right. He was being passive. He was playing defense in his own mind. He had to stop reacting and start acting. Stop whining and face him. Bakugo's voice was the abrasive encouragement he hadn't known he needed. It wasn't a comforting hand on his shoulder. It was a firm shove in the right direction. Deku skidded to a halt in the middle of the gym floor. He closed his eyes, ignoring Bakugo, ignoring the physical world around him. Face him. The command echoed in his mind. He couldn't fight a shadow. He had to go to the source. He had to intentionally walk into the lion's den. He took a deep breath and plunged inward. The transition was jarring. One moment he was in the dusty, metal-scented air of Gym Gamma. The next, he was standing on the cracked, black obsidian floor of the altered vestige realm. The oppressive cyan sky pulsed with a cold, unnatural light. In the distance, the other vestiges, Nana Yoichi and the others, were still faint, powerless specters, watching with expressions of deep concern. And on the throne, solid and imposing, sat the second user. His glowing cyan eyes were fixed on Deku, his expression one of cold annoyance. You are supposed to be fighting. The second's voice resonated through the space. This retreat into your own mind is another act of cowardice. No, Deku said, his voice steadier this time. He was on the second's home turf, but Bakugo's fiery words had forged a new spine of resolve within him. This is the real fight. Right here. You and me. He took a step forward, expecting to hit the invisible wall of pressure from before. This time, it wasn't there. The second seemed to be allowing this confrontation. Curious. I want to understand, Deku said, stopping a respectful but firm distance from the throne. You said you're from a time of war? You said my way is wrong? Show me. Don't just tell me. Show me why you think you're right. A flicker of something. Surprise? Grudging respect? Passed over the second's hard features. He had expected a frightened child, a pleading mess. He had not expected a direct, open challenge to his entire philosophy. Understanding is a path to acceptance, the second stated, a warning in his tone. Be careful what you ask for. 9th. My truth is not a pleasant one. I'm not a child playing with a cannon, Deku said, throwing the second's own words back at him. I'm the one who has to aim it. So I need to understand how it works. And that means understanding you. The second user was silent for a long moment, his cyan eyes studying Deku with a new intensity. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hand. The world around them dissolved. The obsidian throne room melted away, replaced by a scene of utter devastation. They were standing in the skeletal ruins of a city. Buildings were hollowed out husks, their steel frames twisted into grotesque shapes. The sky was a permanent, sickly ochre, choked with smoke and dust. The air tasted of ash and blood. Fires burned in the distance, casting a hellish glow on the rubble-strewn streets. This wasn't a simulated disaster zone like the USJ. This was an apocalypse. Where is this? Deku whispered, horrified. This was my home. The second user's voice was a low growl beside him. Deku turned to see the second standing next to him, no longer on a throne but on the broken pavement, his gaze sweeping over the ruins with a grim familiarity. This was the world under the first reign of All for One. Before quirks were categorized. Before heroes and villains were neat little labels. There was only one label that mattered, Survivor. The scene shifted. They were now inside one of the ruined buildings, hiding behind a crumbling wall. Peering through a crack, Deku saw a group of terrified, emaciated civilians, men, women, children, huddled together in a makeshift shelter. They were ragged, starving, their faces masks of hopeless terror. Standing before them was a hulking figure, a monstrous man with multiple arms, each ending in a different brutal weapon, a blade, a hammer, a claw. He was one of All for One's lieutenants, a being of pure malice. He's going to kill them! Deku gasped, his hero instincts screaming at him to intervene. He tried to move, but his legs were rooted to the spot. This was a memory, a vision. He was just an observer. From the shadows, two figures emerged. One was the second user, younger, his face even harder and more desperate. The other was a thin, frail-looking man with white hair, Yoichi Shigaraki, the first. The plan was simple. The present-day second narrated, his voice devoid of emotion. Yoichi would create a diversion. His quirk was weak, only able to pass itself on. But he was fast and clever. While the monster was distracted, I would strike from behind. A lethal blow. The only way. Deku watched as the vision played out. The younger Yoichi threw a rock, drawing the monster's attention. He was impossibly agile, leading the beast on a chase through the ruins. The younger second moved in, his hands glowing with a faint energy, a kinetic amplification quirk he must have had before receiving One for All. He was aiming for the creature's neck, a killing strike. But at the last second, Yoichi cried out. No, don't kill him! We can stop him! There has to be another way. That moment of hesitation, that plea for mercy, was all it took. The monster, hearing the cry, spun around. One of its bladed arms lashed out, catching the second in the side, sending him crashing into a wall. The other arm, the one with the claw, shot out and grabbed Yoichi. The present-day second didn't flinch as he watched his own past self get injured. But his form seemed to tense, a phantom pain echoing across the centuries, as he watched what happened next. The monster laughed, a horrible, grating sound. It held the struggling Yoichi up for the second to see. And then, with a final, brutal squeeze, it crushed him. Deku cried out, a strangled, horrified sound. He had seen Yoichi in the vestige realm, had spoken with him. He was a kind, gentle soul. To see him murdered so brutally. But the horror wasn't over. The monster, having dispatched Yoichi, turned its attention back to the cowering civilians. And with a roar of triumph, it slaughtered them all. The vision faded, leaving Deku back in the black, obsidian space, on his hands and knees, panting and sick to his stomach. The image of the massacre was burned into his retinas. The second user stood over him, his expression as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. That, he said, his voice like chipping stone, is the price of hesitation. That is the cost of another way. Yoichi was my friend. My leader. He believed in the good in people. He believed in second chances, and his belief got him and 24 innocent people killed. I held this power next. I inherited his will, but I would not repeat his mistake. The world shifted again. This time, they were in a dark, grimy alley. The second user, older now, his body bearing the scars of 100 battles, stood before a fallen villain. The man was beaten, one of his arms clearly broken, but he was spitting defiance. You won't kill me, hero! The villain sneered, blood dripping from his lips. It's not what you do. You'll lock me up, and I'll get out. And when I do, I'll find that little resistance camp of yours, and I'll burn it to the ground with everyone you love inside it. The second didn't say a word. He simply raised his hand, which now crackled with the faint, multi-hued energy of a burgeoning one for all. Deku watched, his heart pounding, as the second user ended the man's life. It wasn't done with anger or rage. It was done with a calm, solemn finality. It was an equation being solved, a threat being permanently removed from the board. The alley faded. They were back in the throne room. I did not enjoy it, the second said, resuming his seat on the obsidian throne. It was not a thing of pride. It was a duty. A grim necessity. For every one I eliminated, 12 more lives were saved. That is the brutal calculus of war. A calculus you refuse to accept. The space around them flickered one last time, forming a new, terrifyingly familiar simulation. They were back on the rooftop at the USJ. Uraraka was on the ground, her leg pinned. Conductor was advancing on her, his baton raised. But this time, the simulation continued from the point where Deku had hesitated. He saw himself, wreathed in green lightning, launching a desperate, full-power, but ultimately non-lethal St. Louis smash. The simulated conductor, with a cold smile, simply sidestepped. The blast of wind tore a hole in the building behind him but left him untouched. And while the simulated Deku was recoiling, his arms shattered and useless, conductor flicked his wrist. Deku was forced to watch, his mind screaming, as an invisible force struck Uraraka. He saw her go limp, her head lolling to the side at an unnatural angle, the light fading from her kind brown eyes. No! Deku screamed, the sound echoing in the mental realm. The simulation continued. Conductor, facing no further resistance, simply walked over to the broken, weeping form of the simulated Deku. A lesson written in blood, he said before delivering a final, fatal tap of his baton. The vision ended with the sight of Deku's own lifeless eyes staring up at the sky.